Hey guys, Darcy here, and today we're going to talk about 5 questions people always ask about Apollo interfaces. Let's jump into it. The first question that always gets asked is, what is the difference between an Apollo interface and any other interface? I want to answer this question if you are brand new to interfaces altogether and you're wondering why the Apollo interface is so much more expensive than, say, a Focusrite 2i2. The main core answer to this is that an Apollo interface, in combination with its software, it can process a sound going through it before it gets to whatever software you're recording to, your DAW, Final Cut, whatever it may be. Let's back this up for a second. Any normal interface is going to amplify the sound of your microphone or whatever the source is you have hooked up to it. It's going to convert it to digital, and then whatever software you're using is going to then record that into, say, for instance, Logic, Pro Tools, Luna, whatever it may be. When it comes to the Apollo interface, it is going to do similarly, amplify the signal that's coming through, but then it has the ability to change the color of the sound of its amplifier. And then you can also put effects inside the chain before it hits whatever software it's going to. So for instance, for myself, I have some compression, some EQ, and some other processing effects that are happening to my vocal as I'm talking in real time. And then it gets to whatever software you're using. This emulates the idea of analog gear, where you would have hooked this up to multiple rack units or a console, like an actual physical board. All of that would process your sound before it ever hit the computer. And that is the main difference. With an Apollo, as the signal passes through, you have the option to process the sound, whereas with other interfaces, you're going to get the raw sound only. The next question or concern people have is that their Apollo gets hot. This is completely normal. The Apollo is designed to be hot. If you actually look at the box that it's built in, it's a heat sink that actually has plenty of ventilation and means of actually getting rid and dispersing that heat that it comes with. In terms of this being normal, the actual manual for my Apollo Twin MK2, 32 to 95 degrees Fahrenheit or 0 to 35 degrees Celsius as the normal operating temperature range. That's really just what it's expecting to be. You don't need to actually add additional ventilation. I've seen people say they put a fan underneath it and it keeps it nice and cool, but you can actually create problems as you're pushing dust up into its actual components. It's meant to be hot, just don't put it in a hot environment and don't put it around or on top of other hot things. That'll help keep the temperature down. That's just how it's made. The next thing people want to know is, how many plugins can I run with my interface? Or why am I running out of space for plugins with my interface? Each Apollo unit comes with a different number of Shark chips, or in other words, CPU chips meant specifically for digital signal processing, or DSP. It's a lot of acronyms, but basically it just means that each Apollo unit can process a different number of plugins that come specific for universal audio. If you get, for instance, like I have an Apollo Twin Duo, that means the Duo is 2 chips. If you had an Apollo Solo, you would have 1 chip. If you had one of the rack units, you'd have a different number of chips. You can also buy the satellites. I have one of those as well, and add more chips specifically for mixing purposes of how many plugins you can run. So I have 2 chips by default, but with my satellite, I am up to 10 chips total. How many chips do you need is the question you want to know. And this really depends on what you plan to use the Apollo for. If it is simply just a means of recording and doing real-time processing before it hits your computer, you may need less chips. There is a DSP chart that you can look at from Universal Audio, which I will link in the description, that goes over different plugins and how much they require in terms of DSP processing. I'll now bring up on the screen two different plugins for you to look at. First off, these chip usage percentages are based on measurements of 44.1 kilohertz. So this will change with sample rate, but this is just giving you a baseline expectation. For instance, the highest one that I found in the list was Capital Chambers at 74% for both mono and stereo. There's a slight difference, but I'm just rounding it here for simplicity. Capital Chambers is basically using almost an entire chip on its own. If you were planning to record directly through that or listen to that in your headphones while recording, you're gonna need more than one chip because you would basically have almost no room left for anything else. For instance, on the low end, the API preamp only uses 9% on mono and 13 on stereo. So the answer really comes down to, what do you plan to use? And that requires, you use something like a Capital Chambers, then you would want to have 2 to 4 chips, for instance. I have 2 chips for my recording because the satellite does not impact how much you have when you are recording. Your interfaces are the only thing that can do that real-time processing from a recording perspective. Now, if you plan to use UAD plugins from a mixing perspective, then you may want to expand even further and have more chips, simply because as you get to mixing, you're going to put in more plugin inserts throughout the entire mix. So therefore, you might be more limited. Another common question is, can I combine or daisy chain my interfaces? You can, in certain combinations. There is some documentation I will link to, but for instance, I'm running an Apollo Twin daisy chained with a UAD2 satellite. There's possibilities you won't just have to buy one and then replace it with the other necessarily. And the last question that's been the most recent question people have been asking is, now with UAD Spark, is an Apollo interface even worth it? This is an interesting question because it depends on what you were planning to use the interface for. If your entire purpose of buying the interface was to use the plugins, but to not use any of the real-time processing that the interface is meant for, then maybe not. I mean, there are plugins, tons of them, that are not available in Spark yet, but if you have no desire to use all of those different plugins, then Spark might be your way, especially if you don't have much knowledge of all of the different plugins. If you knew, oh, I want this particular plugin from Universal Audio and it's not in Spark, there's no other way you can do it right now unless they introduce it to that subscription later in the future, but there's no idea or no way you can plan for when that's going to happen. If you are planning to actually utilize, the interface for its real-time processing, you have real reason to actually get that interface. But again, if you're just using your interface to listen to what comes out of your computer and to only use their plugins, I would start with the Spark subscription and stick with whatever interface you have or whatever interface you're planning to buy that was of quality and of good budget for you, because I think that the value in the interface has to be in the interface itself for you and not just in the plugins that come with it. Hopefully you found this helpful. If you did, let me know that in the comments. If you had questions I did not answer, also leave those in the comments. Make sure to subscribe if you're brand new so you don't miss out on anything. And otherwise, have yourself a good day. Peace.